I'm Amy Seaman, our Director of Policy and Science for Montana Audubon. And both Bo and I are based out of Helena here. And for Montana Audubon, this is actually only the second year that we've sort of formally participated in Helena's Migratory Bird Day celebration. So it's been an exciting time, and I know the group of folks in Helena that are working on the project are really excited to share some new activities and again be present at the regulating reservoir this Saturday. So for those, if you don't know what International Migratory Bird Day is, it's really kind of a fun day to participate in, and something that I'm really glad Montana Audubon has chosen to join, because it really is a worldwide celebration, primarily the Western Hemisphere. So Canada and Mexico, Canada and the US celebrate every year in May, and then Mexico actually celebrates in October. So that's why you see that here, but it is internationally celebrated. And this year there were over 700 activities across the 3 countries to celebrate these birds. So here in Helena, most of our events, you can figure out where they are and how to get to them through the Discovery Foundation website. And you'll see here our list of partners in Montana, or even just really locally. So the Discovery Foundation, Montana Fish, Wildlife Parks, Helena, Lewis and Clark National Forest, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Birds and Beasleys, Montana Audubon, Prickly Pear Land Trust, Boy Scouts of America, and Girl Scouts of America. And so it's a really fun project, and basically a huge push for educating about migratory birds every year. We do have a whole suite of events this week. So this is just one of them. They did start earlier this week, but I wanted to make sure to take 1 minute to just point out on the Discovery Foundation's website that there is the activity tomorrow, which is the Downtown Bird Walk, which will relate directly to this talk today. It's a little bit of a different type of bird walk in that part of what you would be doing is focusing on actually trying to decide or see if Helena has overnight migratory bird mortalities that are potentially caused by light pollution in the city. So it's actually kind of a walk of discovery to figure out if we have a problem. And as we talk through today, we'll talk about why that might be important. And then, as I mentioned, the regulating reservoir is having a big, not big, but a small festival again in person with bird walks, a viewing at the Heron Rookery oversight, and some other activities. So just know that things are back in the loop, and this happens every year in Helena, and we've been looking forward to being a part of it. Each year when International Migratory Bird Day is selected, they select a theme. And it's basically a theme that's meant to just help broadly educate about an issue that impacts migratory bird species across the board. So impacts that really, as this picture shows, impacts large species like owls, small species like warblers, even other large shorebirds or ducks. And it really, this image that speaks to the theme so well, because as you'll see, this threat, artificial light at night, does affect nearly all species, somewhat non-discriminately. And it really speaks to the fact that humans are part of the cause of that threat, but that also means that we can be a part of the solution. One of the reasons International Migratory Bird Day is such a great day to learn about issues that are broad scale is because when it comes to talking about migration, birds are really that first and foremost group that we think of. And I love this image because it's happening all over the world, bird migration, and it's happening twice a year. And it's something that most of us as people experience in some way, along with those birds. So marking of the seasons, especially spring and fall, as they're moving to and from nesting grounds. So we're all pretty intimately aware of this phenomenon. And so this image here shows some of the primary routes around the world. Each of these little corridors has different names, but what's important to think is that about 40% of the birds, if you have to put a number to it, are considered regular migrants. So around the world, that's about 4,000 species. As the arrows show, though, of course, the distance that some of those species are traveling really does vary widely based on where they are, but also what type of species they are. So zooming in just to the flyways that overlap the North America, you see that we have 4 primary corridors. And if we were to zoom in on some certain maps of Montana as well, we would see that our western 2 most flyways, the Pacific and Central Flyway, actually overlap pretty well in Montana. And so that should give us a good awareness that our spring and fall skies are actually filled with quite a lot of birds. And as these pictures show, the sandhill cranes are super common, really, really famous for the Central Flyway, just tons of them going over at night, but as well as smaller shorebirds. And then of course, the millions and millions of small songbird birds that are gonna travel to the boreal forest. Less so when we do think about migration, we may not think about why it happens at night or the fact that actually most birds are migrating at night and not in the daytime when we think it'd be easier for them to see. It's been a fascinating thing to ecologists over time, something that's quite frankly preoccupied them, trying to understand how they do it, why, what kind of signals they use, and trying to understand as well why they go at night. There's some general consensus around why the nighttime may be better. And it's likely that there's an absence of predators, things like diurnal raptors that really like to eat small birds. Partly it's because the air temperatures are actually cooler. So as they're expending a ton of energy migrating, the air temperature can actually keep them from overheating, even though we think it might be cold. And as well, there's actually less turbulence in the air. So as they're expending all that energy, it's actually just simpler for them. So it may seem shocking to us, or maybe we're afraid of the dark or something, but it actually is much easier for these birds to migrate at night. It's hard also to talk about migration without talking about some of the fun cues that birds actually use to do this at night, because as I mentioned, we probably think of them as very visual creatures, but they have to be relying on other cues at night. So there are actually some really interesting studies that go all the way back to the 1960s, where captive birds were put inside of, planetariums, so they could actually manipulate the location of the stars to understand if in fact locations of the stars or birds understanding where north and south are do in fact impact the direction that they'll fly. So they took birds during this, a really fun word, it's called Zuganru. It's that period of restlessness before birds migrate. They put them into small funnels, and then they put them in the planetarium, and they put ink pads at their feet. And what they did was manipulate the location of the stars. And as they did that, the birds would hop towards the direction that they wanted to migrate and actually leave little footprints because of stepping on the ink pads. So what they could see is by actually swapping what birds would normally see in the northerly sky for the southerly sky stars, that they could actually trick the birds to going either direction, indicating that they actually are using the location of stars to impact the direction that they go. So I think we probably have a little bit of jealousy in that, since it's not that easy for us to do it anymore. But beyond using the stars, you know, some of the other cues they use for when to migrate just include the length of daylight. But there's also some suspicion that whether it's proteins in their eyes or certain chemicals inside of their brains, that birds can actually also detect the Earth's magnetic field. So certainly experiments are ongoing, but there's a lot of fascinating research about how and why birds migrate at night. Back to what we would normally conceive of or be able to imagine is that during the day, we can imagine what the habitats look like that birds encounter as they're flying at night. But more so, we think about them like this satellite image here in Montana, thinking of just the habitats that they're using themselves. But this makes the image in that theme poster all the more relative, because rather than thinking of what we know here of the Montana landscape, it's really important to think about what the birds are going to interact with at night. And here's this familiar image that likely everyone has seen of North America at night, heavily lit by artificial lights across the country. Of course, us here in Montana with a little bit of a benefit and a little bit darker skies. But then if you expand out and look a little broader across the globe, it's estimated that about 10% of the Earth's surface is actually now under artificial light at night. So major impacts to the stars and other indicators that would be visible to birds. And what we see from these images, jumping back to North America really quickly, is that for better or worse, our areas of most dense artificial light also overlap very heavily with our areas of very heavy bird migration. So this is a really cool image of a fun phenomenon that you can actually see eruptions of migratory birds through Doppler radar. And so there are all kinds of good migration trackers. I didn't take time to go through them in this presentation, but kind of wanted to. But you can just Google migration forecast, and folks are able to tell based on weather, winds, etc., when you may have something like this happen at night, where there's just really large numbers of birds moving across the country. And I like this image as well, because when you think of these bright green areas as the highest density of birds flying around, we know that this type of phenomenon is basically happening almost every night, April and May, in our country. But again, we have these areas of heavy migration overlapping with areas of heavy artificial light, which gives us this deduction that yes, definitely artificial light is going to affect birds' travel. And so now we'll just talk a little bit about that. But also, luckily, I think with the identification of a threat like artificial light, it is something that's tangible and concrete, that there are really good solutions people can take to make some improvements. But given that, we do have to work together and keep educating, because certain areas of the night sky are now actually considered imperiled. And we'll talk very little bit about a group called International Dark Skies Association, but they actually work hard with local communities and regions across the world to identify those areas where the night sky really may be in peril, but where there are opportunities to make a difference. And as you can imagine, we talked a little bit about the threats that birds may or may not avoid by flying at night, like other predators or good weather, etc. But when you do have light pollution, some of the perils that come along with night are actually amplified. So in addition to having light pollution, sometimes we stick really tall buildings in the direct pathway of that light pollution that may actually act as a draw for migratory birds. So especially, oops, sorry about that. I don't know if I may move the screen for you guys. But especially on nights that are stormy or foggy or rainy, things like that, when the cloud ceiling comes really low, that light pollution actually just creates a really crazy fog that can be really disorienting for birds. And typically that light just confuses them. It can get them to circle and often can actually pull them off course. Of course, it disorients their ability to see and use stars to migrate. For those of you, if you're close to Helena or close to Butte, often light pollution, when there's storms at night, light pollution can really impact the negative effect that those storms have on migratory birds. And so in both of the instances where we've seen large numbers of snow geese get pushed down into the Berkeley pit, it's actually often happened on foggy or rainy nights when this low ceiling gets the birds really disoriented. It pulls them a little off their trajectory. So rather than flying west or east of the pit, they actually end up going straight over it, seeing it as a really dark, kind of safe looking body of water. So what's also interesting is that we have gotten really, really good at making lights. So of course, it's not just city lights that are impactful, but just general floodlights that people are using for coastal navigation, lighthouses, airport lights, things that we think of as, of course, really, really important for safety may all actually have negative impacts for birds. The one I find most surprising is that even some of these very heavily lit vessels, like large yachts and cruise ships, can disrupt birds way out at sea, where we typically, in that static map of lights at night, think of there being much less light pollution than on land. And there is certainly less pollution on land, light pollution on land. And luckily for us in Montana, what we would assume is there's also much less light pollution, you know, in rural areas versus urban areas. But before I go too far into what light pollution is doing to affect birds, I just am going to clarify the term, because sometimes we obviously do want to have lights, whether it is for our own safety and navigation or ships at sea and things like that. But it really is any type of this excess light dispersing into the environment, creating that kind of glow. So that's what we call as low ceiling nights. Will be clouds low in the sky. It's kind of orange. Things are hazy, and that condition in particular is very, very disruptive. So even though the amount of light we may be emitting every day is the same, the amount of light pollution that will be the effect is not going to be the same, but will be a little bit dependent on weather. And so what's interesting when we think not just of the birds migrating at night, but how birds behave at night, or especially birds that are actually nocturnal, we see that some of the effects are a little bit more subtle than just outright collision with buildings or outright throwing them off course. Some of the impacts are actually just behavioral. So nocturnal hunters, they're going to use the cover of night. But what happens is that if there's artificial light where night hunting species are used to operating, they either can't handle the glare, or species that they would compete with, like diurnal raptors, something like a red-tailed hawk, may actually have more success hunting that night because they can use the light to their advantage versus a nocturnal animal that's relying on other cues and certainly hiding its own self at night. So that kind of seems silly, but it may mean that it's just simply more difficult for nighttime predators to get prey. And then on the flip side, it may be easier for daytime hunters to get more prey, basically just continuing their daytime activity into the night because of expanded visibility. Moving towards what we think of as our diurnal species, our daytime singers, our dawnbreak chorus, it's also interesting that a study in 2014 from Australia showed that artificial light can also impact songbird reproduction. And it really had to do with what triggered the singing males to start displaying in the morning. So to a female selecting a mate, a male who's really singing vigorously in the morning, displaying a bunch, putting out a lot of energy, they're showing a lot of vigor and dominance, and that's something that a female bird may actually select for. So having artificial light in some areas may cause males to sing much earlier than they normally would, sort of amplifying that cycle of vigor and actually impacting female selection. So this is kind of a really nuanced look at how light may affect species, but something that certainly over the lifetime of birds, especially birds that need to also perform a migration, have just continual impacts. So any birds that sort of are impacted by light in this way, they just might have an overall lower reproduction or an overall increase in mortality. And as I mentioned before, and you can see in this image here, the levels of light pollution, of course, are not surprisingly going to vary by region and vary as you go from a more suburban to a more rural area. And so it's this major phenomenon that collective we started noticing, especially that urban areas are one of the most dangerous for migratory birds. In Canada, they started a fatal lights awareness program. We'll talk a tiny bit about more here, but they've estimated that 25 million birds may die each year on migration from hitting windows and this combination of window and artificial light issues, because the cities themselves can be so disorienting and often have such tall buildings that are very heavily covered in glass. The reason as well this image here is really important is because of, as I mentioned early in the talk, is that this threat is basically non-discriminate. So many species are impacted each year, excuse me, and especially our smaller migratory species, like these warblers that are often passing all the way over the United States to hit their boreal nesting grounds in Canada. One really interesting study and very specific record of just how artificial light impacts birds was actually a new phenomenon that didn't occur until the 9/11 tribute lights went up. And ironically enough, these lights, because they do create beams of artificial light going straight into the sky, they actually found this one study that over 160,000 birds may be attracted every year to the tribute lights. But what it actually does is it does disorient them. It does get them to circle, and it actually has become such an issue that they've discussed it so that they will turn the lights off on particularly heavy migration times, because obviously that's not the intent of the tribute of lights. So, but it ended up becoming an unintended experiment that demonstrates this impact. The other thing, though, that this study was such a good reminder or indicator of, and something that we would not be surprised by, is that the effects of artificial light and light pollution are going to go much further than just the birds themselves. So in this tribute of light research study, they actually found that many insects as well were becoming wrapped up in this sort of disorientation from artificial lights. So the dots are actually birds and insects that are ending up circling the towers, getting pulled off course. And so that's something we don't think about as much. Anecdotally, something that I've come across I find most interesting are things like lightning bugs. And actually in the Asian continent, there are so many more lightning bugs than we would think about that all rely on some type of illumination signaling to communicate with their mates. And so artificial light as well is putting that type of mating behavior at risk. And something we don't always talk about, and maybe not even often enough, is that there are, of course, human health effects of artificial light and light pollution as well. Just like all the other creatures, you know, we've developed rhythms for the natural dark and light cycles. And so humans as well are not experiencing these truly, truly dark nights. And there's some suspicion that it could impact our health just through increasing risks of obesity, depression, general sleep disorders, cancers, and other things, which hopefully doesn't add to the stress, but knowing that we can create a dark night for other animals will actually improve conditions for ourselves as well. The cycle of light and dark we have it does directly actually affect the melatonin that our body produces itself. And so we can kind of at least step back and say, hey, thinking about this threat will improve conditions across the board. And then getting into why we have a morning hike tomorrow, really the first step in identifying these issues and trying to figure out what the heck to do is just to start recording mortalities. So until the Tribute of Lights and the Canadian program realized that there were major problems that they might need to take action against, they did have to start with just recording the mortality and the threats that they see. So for the first time ever, which is really fun because as you all can imagine, a couple of groups in Montana, we've been scheming on, could we do some of our own tracking, recognizing that we don't have the types of cities that some other places do. But we were really, really interested in this issue. And it came up from Montana Audubon, the Montana chapter of the International Dark Sky Society, and then working off of what FLAP Canada and National Audubon has done. These groups kind of came together to just create a super simple tracking form to see if there is a threat in our city, in this case, Helena. So tomorrow will be our first organized downtown walk to try to see if maybe some birds hit windows overnight. Of course, there is the whole separate issue of just birds striking windows generally, but we know for a fact that light pollution is a main contributor to that. These groups have found that one of the best ways to tackle issues once they find them are actually to employ ordinances in a city or county to have a dark sky. And so actually right now, Montana has its first that's getting started in Red Lodge, where that group of the International Dark Skies Association is working with the city council to say, hey, what can we do to really conserve our dark night skies? And of course, figuring out where we need to keep dark is more easy using those images at night, but to figure out what species of birds or where birds are being impacted really does take some small on the ground effort. So we will be trying that out, and a number of cities have done this for a really, really long time. FLAP Canada in Toronto is where it started, and they have just found hundreds and hundreds of warblers, almost every species, and they will do annual monitoring to see how this threat affects species. But as usual, we have to flip that on its head because, as I mentioned before, luckily, the threat of light pollution is something that we really can directly tackle. And groups like International Dark Skies Association, FLAP Canada, National Audubon as well has its own dark skies program, have come to the fact that there are some solutions to night lighting that can help protect the night, minimize bird death, fortunately have other positive outcomes of saving money on energy usage, supporting sustainability goals if you have them for your own house or for an office or organization that you're running. People can get recognized for being sustainable. And you can also kind of create bird-friendly certifications and things like that. So a lot of it is about creating awareness about simple things that can be done. So a quick side note, and I didn't want to take too much time to go through this, but the International Dark Skies Association has a fascinating presentation on how thinking about these 5 principles for outdoor lighting can really, really make a big difference. And it's just making sure that they're useful, targeted, etc. I didn't actually note that it says 5 principles, but there are only 4 here, so that I will flag. But generally making sure the light is doing what we want it to do, and just that actually has all of those benefits I mentioned. And I think in listening to some of their presentations, one of the most illuminating facts is that sometimes, we think we're doing good often as humans by lighting a situation more so that people could see intruders or strangers or things around a house, but that actually sometimes the way that we create floodlights or security lighting actually makes it harder for our own eyes to see. So doing these controlled lighting techniques actually improves our own safety, but it may be slightly counterintuitive. And here's an image that shows that a little bit. The top part shows how angled lights or beams coming from lights that either shine into the sky or across the city or down from street lights all has its sort of sphere of impact. And if you look at the lower image, just by changing the shape of a light fixture, you can really control the shape and direction of that beam. So taking an extra minute to consider, do we need light above this source or just below, can already have a significant impact. And here's what that can look like in real life. Just doing a little before and after of putting small covers on street lights that are meant to help illuminate entryways and areas for human safety, but will actually be polluting the environment for other species if we don't think it all through. And so that's a simple solution because, we do need to just think of the fact that every night there's these huge eruptions of migratory birds. And for us here in Montana, that's September, October. April and May are just super busy, even parts of early March, just really busy at night. And all of these birds kind of need all of our help along the way. And again, especially considering it's a threat, that's something we can do that we can manage very directly. And so hopefully that's a good quick overview of the issue and why this year's theme is Dim the Lights for Migratory Birds. They just really need dark skies. I love this picture as well because we are lucky in Montana, but I think we recognize that a lot of people need them as well, that we need to see the stars and be connected to our dark skies that way. And so we have a good role to play. We do have opportunities, whether it's through modifying our own dwellings or our city's dwellings, but also doing city or local ordinances to just make small improvements. And so I'd love to have you all join us tomorrow. Bo Crees, our avian specialist, will be leading that hike again. That meets at Birds and Beasley's, but otherwise I'm happy to chat and take some questions and talk about artificial light a little bit more.